Hello, welcome back to this channel, or welcome to this channel. I am wearing a wig today. This is the first time I'm wearing a wig on the channel. It's not the first time I'm filming with a wig because I already tried to film this once because I thought I could pull off the wig without the wig cap because I just got the wig cap delivered like 10 minutes ago. But when I tried to film without the wig cap, one of my hairs was sticking out the whole video and I tried to edit it like that and it just killed me. So here we are filming this video again. So today I wanted to talk about fashion activism and sort of give a very brief history, which is more of a survey of the history, kind of like picking and choosing a few cool examples and thinking about the different insights that each of those examples can give us into what it really means for fashion to be a mode of activism. So for your fashion itself to be sort of like an activist action. So I started off this endeavor with an idea that fashion can be activist, which is because I've been super interested in several fashion subcultures, and I've been discovering a lot of ways that those subcultures incorporate activism. And so I've been starting to think more and more about how fashion itself can be activist and trying to think about like what is the power of just the clothing itself, because I think that's super cool. Once I had this idea, I googled fashion as activism, and there is a Wikipedia page, but it is tiny. There are 3 examples on the Wikipedia page. At the top they do like a really brief like summary explanation, you know, like what is at the top of all Wikipedia pages, you know? The examples they give are the mini skirt, the slogan t-shirt, and the kafia or kefie. I'm not positive on my pronunciation. The first 2 I think are pretty obvious. I like the miniskirt. That's my favorite example on this page, but that's mainly because I'm not familiar with the 3rd example. I will say I feel like saying a slogan t-shirt is activist is kind of a cop-out because it's almost more like the equivalent of holding a sign, and there isn't much involvement with the idea of fashion itself. So I don't have as much interest in the slogan t-shirt, so I'm not going to get too into that. But so, kind of going to go down 2 main streams of examples. One has to do with themes of like race as well as revolutionary vibes, for lack of a better word. I want to start out by talking about Che Guevara. So Che has become a huge symbol for revolution, and particularly Marxist revolution, because he had a large part in the revolution in Cuba, which installed a communist government. He was also involved in some other like independence movements in that time. I know he went to the Congo, and I'm pretty sure that's where he was killed, was while he was trying to help out in the Congo. But so this is Che, and you've probably seen his face on t-shirts, which may seem kind of like I'm being hypocritical by talking about t-shirts when I just said I don't like slogan t-shirts, but I will say that I think the use of symbols is a lot more powerful. I think symbols hold a lot more weight, and I also like how they mean so much to some people and so little to other people. So the way that it's received is more like a work of art because the imagery's meaning has to be interpreted. It's not obvious. Not to say that words can't have like deeper meanings, but just I'm leaning towards the picture is worth 1,000 words sort of sentiment, and I feel like Che can represent a lot to people who are maybe more familiar with those movements. You know, like anti-colonialism and like independence and reclaiming identity, all kinds of things. And so the main reason I bring up Che is because I want to talk about the Black Panthers uniform, because I feel like when I first looked at their uniform I thought of Che, and then I did some date checking, and this picture of Che, which is on the cover of his Wikipedia page, is from 1960, and it seems like the Black Panthers were more wearing this uniform, being photographed in this uniform in the late 60s, early 70s. So I think it's very possible that they are in fact inspired by not necessarily just Che himself, but sort of the culture that Che represents and the movements that Che represents. And I think the Black Panthers are super interesting because of how their uniform invokes evokes some militaristic vibes, mainly like the fact that it is a uniform that they all wear, that they're trying to look uniform. It's supposed to show a kind of like power in unity that militaries do and go for with their uniforms, but the actual clothing pieces and the look itself is very subversive to like traditional military attire, and I think it calls on the sort of look of the more guerrilla fighters like Che, who were really like considered sort of underdogs and tended to be facing larger oppressors particularly supported by like the capitalist West, mainly the United States and like Western Europe. And so choosing this appearance has like a very strong message about what the Black Panthers want, and I think it relates a lot to what their organization and movement was really about in terms of like liberation and independence, and all of those themes seem to align. I'm not going to get too deep into the history themselves, more just kind of like dabble in why these are interesting fashions to consider in the context of activism. Moving forward, I wanted to give a special little honorary mention, because it appears in a lot of articles I did find about fashion activism, to Beyonce's Super Bowl performance outfits that were also inspired by the Black Panthers, and sort of just showing how that fashion, literally like the style of the clothing, because it's not even exact pieces, it's just like the style, mainly the hat on the afro and then the sort of leather jacket are the main elements, how those have such a strong message for like power for African Americans, for like Black liberation. But so now I wanted to move into a different avenue of fashion activism and talk about feminism, because I think almost the entire history of feminism has had fashion as a strong part of the different movements. I know there are examples even older than this, but the one big one that comes to mind is in the like women's suffrage movement, or like first wave feminism, or even pre-first wave feminism. Women choosing to wear trousers or pants had a very strong political message to it, mainly in that it was putting women visually into a category that had previously been exclusively for men by wearing a piece of clothing that women were not supposed to wear. I think the sort of activist statement of that is very clear, but I also think it's really interesting to think about this and future examples for feminism specifically as somewhat different from the Black Panther example, in that the Black Panther uniforms only really work and only have meaning because it was a group undertaking and it was an intentional group organized undertaking. Whereas I feel like with pants, for example, this happened on more of an individual level, with like single women deciding to wear pants and make that statement, and they were often not supported by other women out in public making that same statement. So it has a very different sort of activist power and like assertiveness because it is so like singular, and I think therefore it maybe took even more confidence for the first women to wear those pair of pants outside, because literally everyone around them felt like they could harass them for that decision. Obviously, I'm not trying to directly compare the struggles of African Americans with the struggles of women. Separate issues, also intersectional issues. I'm just saying like the individual's experience as an activist is very different in like that group organized setting versus an entirely individual setting. Hopefully that makes sense. Because the later things within feminism that I think are interesting are like the flapper look, which was the first sort of feminist act that went into the realms of sexuality intentionally. So this one was more about like women claiming the right to control their body and their appearance. So it wasn't just about like women can be as good as men. It's more like we as women have the right to look how we want to look, and we're not going to just look how men tell us we should look, you know? Slightly different kind of things going on, but also very similar in that it was not so organized. But also I think it's important to recognize that the flapper movement did have, I think, more of a community aspect than the first women wearing trousers, because it was also about sort of the culture of like dancing and going out and partying and like frivolity of the 1920s, and so you were more likely to surround yourself with people doing the same thing. And I think that might be why at this point a lot of these start to feel more like generational issues, because a lot of it is the youth making these choices to do things a little differently than how their parents did them. Jumping forward, the big example from Wikipedia was the miniskirt. So this one also had a lot to do with sort of sexuality and claiming the bodies of women as belonging to themselves as opposed to belonging to men. Girls basically saying that they should be able to show skin. And then we get into sort of rape culture issues, which are even more prevalent today, with like women going to women marches completely topless or just wearing a bra as a way to say like showing skin doesn't equal sexual consent. But the thing is that all of these are things that like normal girls, normal women would wear out on like normal days, and it would still have a sort of statement to it and a sort of activism to it. But I think it's also interesting to think about things like the miniskirt and the flapper look being also much more accessible and therefore almost becoming more normalized because of how they spread through social networks. So like if your friends got into like dressing flappers and going out dancing, you would be more likely to think, oh, that's not a big deal, that's pretty okay. Whereas before the feminist movement had any sort of traction, those things would be a lot harder. I think it's also interesting to align that miniskirt movement in the 1960s with the second wave of feminism, and it's interesting to think about how these big fashion moments did align with greater feminist thinking and sort of shows that those two were intertwined, and probably it's not like one directly caused the other, but they sort of fed into each other, and that the fashion, therefore, by being so visible, also fairly relatively normal. We're not talking absurd costumes, we're not doing anything crazy. This is something any person could put on. Made it potentially easier for those movements to attract more attention and support. As I'm editing, I'm having so many more ideas about where I could have taken this video, and I feel like I need to throw a few in, even though I don't want to like just talk as a voiceover for too long. But so I wanted to say how that doesn't necessarily mean that other social movements can just apply the same template. Like, I'm not trying to say like, oh, the Black Panthers should have just done this sort of thing that was more accessible so more people could wear it so that blah blah blah. No. Because the thing is that the situation and circumstances surrounding each activist movement are so different that the means for that movement progressing have to be different. And so I think the reason that it worked so well for these fashion moments to be important to feminist activism is because the activism itself was about women's bodies. That makes it make so much sense and be so natural for fashion to play such a huge role. So then I think it's really interesting to see how movements like the Black Panthers that don't have that inherent link are still able to use fashion in like a different and a little more unexpected and maybe even more subversive way. We're gonna wrap up because my camera is literally dying. But so I wanted to give another honorable mention, special shout out, but I don't have time to dig into it, to the Guerrilla Girls. And this was like a very artistic, niche feminist statement group, and they did start out, I think, making the art more so than wearing the fashion, but still counts. I love how they wear gorilla masks to literally just like subvert all norms and expectations of femininity and women having to look good for men and all of that sort of stuff. And I also love how it's a play on the word gorilla. I could get into it more in a separate video maybe, but that is for another day. That is my introduction to / brief history of fashion as activism. I hope this got you thinking a little bit about the statements that clothing can make, and I intend to, in the future, get into fashion subcultures on this channel in a way that addresses their activist elements, but I kind of wanted to have this as like a backbone to refer back to in terms of like thinking about how fashion can be activist and sort of the major historical examples of that. Obviously there's a ton more. If you have a cool example that you can think of or that you really like, I would love if you left it in the comments so I can look into it and maybe do a video on it. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. I really appreciate it when you support the channel because it gives me the will to keep on making videos. So thank you very much. Bye. If you have any ideas for an outro for my videos, I would also appreciate that.